The Canadian society, looking at the present situation of things, often look like it's shrouded in American lifestyle, the politics, media, and even way of life. I know we are from the same continent, but we find a lot of times that the Canadian voice is not amplified and unique enough. Is that a new thing, or is it a thing that comes from the past based on
Yeah,
your
it's not new at all. It's amplified by the hyper-mediated age in which we live. I mean, I'm assigning a class I teach in the 1960s, my students, this book, Lament for a Nation, published back in the mid-1960s by this great Canadian philosopher, George Grant. And mid-1960s, he's saying Canada's dead. He's lamenting this nation, which is going to continue to exist in form, but really it's lost. And, part of what he was saying is part of, I think, what you're getting at is the idea that there's something distinctly unique about Canada, which can withstand the assault of being on a continent with a nation 10 times as large. But not just that, also which just saturates the world's and certainly Canada's cultural system, our news idea, our interests. That maybe even more than that. What Canadians are actually interested in. We're interested and fascinated by America, and we're so close to them. And so on a bunch of levels, we share a continent with a country that we aren't, and yet we love, and that we also hate. And it makes the idea of Canada, it makes living as Canadians very, very distinct. And so everyone in the world, to a certain extent, shares this, the pressure of and the lure of American culture. But certainly for English Canadians, less so for French Canadians, we're just the closest to the beast.
So what do you think is responsible for that? And do you think it's getting worse compared to 1960? If somebody said in 1960s that
Yeah.
Canada is dead, you said, right? I wonder what we should say right now about Canada.
I have two thoughts which are opposite about this.
Okay.
I think clearly, in the current context, we're talking, it's about Donald Trump, the pretty now open threat of a claim to Canada, whether it's serious or not for Canada to become the 51st state, the economic tariffs that could just do incredible damage to the Canadian economy. So that threat is worse maybe than it's been in a long time. But in terms of Canadian culture, I think the fact that you and I are sitting here and talking in a YouTube podcast, and you've created this podcast, I'm not sure when you started, but out of nothing. And I think that idea of the social media age gives just incredible opportunities for Canadians to create their own culture, which is what you're doing, what many people are doing. And that actually is a way of kind of subverting what was a very staid kind of Hollywood system, television system, which kind of controls culture. So there's opportunities for a kind of proliferation of Canadianness all over the place, for individual kind of Canadians to make culture and to get it to Canadians.
So I've always wondered actually what the true Canadian culture is. And I think more and more we hear from government saying that, oh, this is what Canadians like. Not to get into politics right away, but I hear someone like Trudeau saying, Canadians are nice. Canadians want fairness. Canadians want this. And when I get on the street, most times what people want actually differ from what I hear on media. So I've always wondered, apart from, say, King Abdullah in Nova Scotia or Putin, what's the real Canadian culture going from history?
I mean, it's hard to identify one thing, and I think obviously it's got to have a diversity of experiences. I've been on Don Air Corner, Pizza Corner in Halifax. I've also enjoyed that. The Trudeau version is a particular like post 1960s liberal vision of Canada. It's rooted in his dad's vision of Canada, this kind of liberal, continental, individual rights, increasingly progressive. But what progressive means has changed quite drastically over that 50, 60 years since that vision has come into place. And so when people speak about Canada, the current Trudeau government, or not Trudeau government anymore, has a vision of a certain vision of Canada. George Grant, when he's writing in the mid-1960s, he's saying there was an English Canada, but also maybe more broadly a kind of small c conservative vision of Canada, which was there for at least 100, 150 years, which is that we weren't Americans. We hadn't gone the revolutionary path. We had adopted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right. Instead, Canadians had peace, order, and good government. That's the expression from our Constitution, which is to say, we're not going to be the wild, crazy, independent Americans. We're going to be slightly more staid, slightly more cautious, rooted in our traditions. That vision of Canada, which lasted until the 1960s, is quashed in some sense by the Trudeau vision of Canada. It's quashed by continentalism, and it's quashed by multiculturalism, or a certain reading of multiculturalism anyway. When you say, what is the Canada? I mean, in some ways, there isn't a kind of that isn't a grand vision. There are competing visions. Although I feel like if you if you got down to speaking to people across the country, I would think that there would be a shared commitment to a certain notion of a rights culture, right? Right. I think which is, we might have different visions of that. I think it's clear a shared commitment to a kind of cultural tolerance across the country, a shared commitment to not being American. And there'd be a bunch of other things that you would get there. But it's tricky because especially our cultural producers, our cultural elite, differ fundamentally on the vision that they want to sell.
Yeah, so you mentioned in passing the issue of multiculturalism that's in our constitution, and I compare it with the philosophy for living in the American system, for instance, where they talk about the pursuit of happiness, and I think that inherently means the economic potential or prosperity of individuals and the system. We don't have anything like that in our constitution, neither in our philosophy for living. I don't think we're looking at a grand thing to be done, like the American way. And on one hand, we call them the bully Americans, coming from an African background. But there's a good thing in it. There's an inherently good thing in that pursuit of happiness, pursuit of excellence. Everything they do is big. If they make a car, it's big. It drives fast. Too much power. No, those fine details. But we don't have that in the Canadian culture.
The vision was, until, as I say, until through the 60s, and there are still some people you'll find who believe this. The vision was, I call it the POG Canada, peace, order, and good government. It is that we were different. Canada was different because we didn't break from our traditions. We didn't have a revolution. French Canada was maintained their cultural traditions. British Canada, English Canada, pick the moment when Canada becomes independent. You ask Canadians, most Canadians won't have an idea because it happens at so many different points. That was the Canadian story, that we embraced our link to the past, even as we asserted our kind of independent stance within North America. We're Canadians. We're not those British. We don't, when we're fighting the First World War, we want to say we're not the British tough officers. But we also embraced the fact that we'd taken a different path in North America. We'd stayed true to our traditions. And that's what made us different from the Americans. And that's a kind of vision of Canada which was so powerful and has been, in many respects discarded.
Let me follow up on this, too. What do you think about the clause about multiculturalism, especially when you compare it side by side, the modern definition of multiculturalism? Let's also take reference from the past. Do you think this is actually helpful to a present-day Canadian culture?
I think it depends what you mean by multiculturalism. I think multiculturalism, which means an openness to immigrants from around the world, a kind of openness to immigration system which is set up in the 1960s. That's quite deliberately saying we're not going to make race an issue, right? We're not going to make it's called country of origin. Really, is how it was in the system before.
Right.
Pierre Trudeau stands up in the House of Commons in 1971 and announces the multiculturalism policy. He stands up and says there's not going to be one official culture. We have a country with two official languages, but we're not going to have one official culture. And I think there's on the one hand this openness to the world, but there's a tension there, which is to say, does this openness to everyone in the world mean that there can't be a Canadian culture and that there can't be this thing called being Canadian, except to say that we're diverse? And I think that creates a tension in Canada because it makes it hard to say to new immigrants, no, there is this thing that we have in Canada with certain values we have and aspire towards, which I think many people would agree with. But it opens up the idea that asking an immigrant to embrace any kind of Canadian tradition is potentially a kind of disloyal to the idea of multiculturalism. So there's this tension, this kind of openness, but also this possibility that maybe it means that there is no official culture.
Right. So do you think multiculturalism is actually a sustainable philosophy for
a country?
country?
One of my kind of intellectual heroes, a guy named Eugene Forcy, I think he called Canada a collection of shopping malls. By this point, under Pierre Trudeau, even though he liked Pierre Trudeau in some respects. I think it depends what you mean is sustainable. I think if you assume in the one version of multiculturalism that there is no Canadianness, that to speak of Canada as having a culture is somehow discriminatory, then I don't think that's sustainable. There's no counter argument to then why we wouldn't just join the United States. But if you assume that there's another version of multiculturalism, which is to say, we're going to be open to the world, we're going to embrace the possibilities of bringing the best and the brightest from around the world to enrich our country and do this in a non-discriminatory way, that's a vision of multiculturalism and a vision of Canada which is much more sustainable and much more growable.
Revaluate is a project I embarked upon to spark meaningful conversations that can inspire critical thinking as we navigate the adventures of life. The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time.